Hey friends, tonight we begin with You Wouldn't. Survive a week in Victorian London. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe only if you truly enjoy this kind of slow, calming storytelling. Your support means the world and helps me keep creating peaceful spaces like this one. Tell me no in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how this little quiet corner of the internet brings together people from all over the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan or some soft background, and let's gently into tonight's journey together. Imagine stepping off a carriage, the wheels clattering against uneven cobblestones, the thick air heavy with soot from coal fires. The first thing you notice isn't the sight of London, but its smell. It clings to you, a mixture of smoke, human waste, rotting food, horse manure, and the sharp tang of industry. It feels like the very air is trying to choke you before you even take your first full breath. This is Victorian London, and you're transported here for just 1 week are already at a disadvantage. It is the 1850s, and the city is booming, swelling with new arrivals every single day. The Industrial Revolution has transformed London into the beating heart of the British Empire. Factories rise where pastures once stood, railways slice through old neighborhoods, and ships unload endless cargo along the Thames. But for all its wealth and power, London is a city of extremes, of glittering wealth in one quarter and crushing poverty in the next. And if you are not prepared, this city will grind you down. You step into the streets, and they are alive in ways you've never known. Vendors shout, hawking everything from cheap bread to fresh eels. Children dart past you barefoot, their faces smudged with soot, their eyes sharp from years of survival. Men in tall hats hurry by, careful not to brush against you, their coats pristine, their gloved hands hiding the fact that they'd rather not acknowledge the lower classes at all. A horse-drawn omnibus rattles past, packed so tightly with passengers that its windows fog with the heat of their bodies. The noise is deafening, hooves clopping, carriage wheels screeching, vendors yelling, bells clanging, and the occasional shriek of someone who's been jostled or pickpocket-ed. Your first instinct is to take it all in with wide-eyed wonder, but that distraction is dangerous. Within moments, you feel a tug at your coat. A hand darts away, quick as lightning, and you realize your pocket is lighter than it was a moment ago. Welcome to London's underbelly. Pickpockets, often no older than 12, prowl these crowded streets. They are organized, trained, and far more skilled than you. Some work alone, but most answer to larger gangs who control entire neighborhoods. If you are carrying anything of value, money, jewelry, even a pocket watch, it won't last long in your possession. You stumble forward, trying to protect what you have left, and quickly realize there's nowhere to hide. The streets are endless, rivers of humanity pressing in from all sides. You notice the dirt underfoot isn't just dirt at all. It is a sludge of mud, ash, horse dung, and refuse that splashes onto your boots with every step. You instinctively try to sidestep a puddle, only to find it impossible. The puddles here are more like open drains, catching everything the city discards. Women lift their skirts just to wade through, while children stomp without care and all. Around you, streams of human waste from chamber pots emptied directly into the street trickle down toward open sewers. This isn't an occasional sight, it is a daily reality by the time you've crossed just one street. The stench is unbearable. It is the smell of humanity unwashed, of factories belching smoke, of butcher shops tossing offal into gutters, of Thousands of bodies crammed into 2 small spaces. You wipe at your nose, but there's no escaping it. And this isn't just unpleasant, it's dangerous. Diseases like cholera, typhoid, and dysentery thrive in this environment. The very water you might reach for to quench your thirst could kill you. The Thames, the great river running through the city, is little more than an open sewer. Its banks are lined with refuse, dead animals, and effluent from tanneries and factories. Yet, astonishingly, people still drink from it as night begins. To fall, you imagine things might quiet down, but London never sleeps. Gas lamps flicker to life, casting hazy pools of light on the fog-thickened streets. The fog is unlike anything you've seen. Not just mist, but a dense, choking smog of coal smoke and damp air, pressing low until it seems the city itself is suffocating. Figures move through it like phantoms. A carriage wheel appears from nowhere and nearly crushes your foot. A man shouts, his voice disembodied, until he stumbles into view with a lantern. This is the legendary London fog, and it can disorient even those who've lived here their entire lives. For you, a newcomer, it is terrifying. You can barely see a few feet ahead, and in this murk, crime flourishes. Gangs roam in packs, searching for the weak, the lost, or the drunk. Prostitutes call from shadowed doorways, their painted faces eerie in the dim light. Beggars tug at your sleeves, some missing limbs, some little more than children sent out by desperate parents. And always, eyes follow you, measuring, calculating, deciding whether you are an easy target. If you stray into the wrong alley, you may not walk out again. But say you manage to survive this first night. Where will you sleep? London isn't a city that welcomes the poor. Lodgings are scarce, and those who cannot afford a bed often pack themselves into filthy tenements rooms with no ventilation, where entire families sleep side by side on straw mats, and where disease spreads like wildfire. If you cannot pay for even that, your only option may be the workhouse, an institution dreaded by all. To enter means surrendering what little freedom you have, trading your labor for meager food and shelter. Families are torn apart inside. Men, women, and children are separated into different wings, forbidden to see each other except on rare occasions. The food is barely edible, the hours of work grueling, the conditions humiliating. It is survival, but it strips you of dignity. And here lies the real test. Victorian London doesn't kill you outright. It wears you down. It starves you, poisons you, infects you, and grinds away at your spirit until survival itself feels impossible. Even if you've made it through the filth of the streets, the smoke in your lungs, the crime lurking in every shadow, you're not safe. Hunger gnaws at you. Work is brutal. Food is scarce. The cheapest meals available: stale bread, watered down, beer, or a questionable meat. Pie carry their own risks. Many pies sold on the street are stuffed with mystery meat, often from animals you'd rather not imagine. Cats, dogs, even rats have been rumored to find their way into the filling. You can pay for something more reputable, but your coin will not stretch far. Day by day, London closes its grip tighter. The wealth of the city, the carriages, the gas lamps, the fine gentlemen and ladies strolling with parasols is not meant for you. It is meant to be seen but never touched. And the longer you stay, the clearer it becomes. This city was not designed for your survival. It was designed for labor, for commerce, for empire. The people who endure it are hardened by years of struggle. You, arriving suddenly in the thick of it, are far too soft. By the time your first week draws near, you are exhausted. Your lungs ache from smoke. Your stomach churns from questionable food. Your body trembles from lack of rest. Even if you've escaped disease and crime, the weight of the city presses down. The cobblestones seem sharper, the alleys darker, the fog heavier. London doesn't care whether you last or not. It never did. And in the end, it is this indifference that breaks you. Morning in Victorian London comes not with sunshine, but with noise. Long before the sun peeks over the rooftops, the city is already awake. The clang of factory bells echoes down alleys, calling workers to their posts, the rattle of milk carts. And coal wagons mixes with the shouting of vendors, their voices hoarse from years of selling on the streets. If you have survived your first night, you awaken to a world that does not care how exhausted you are. London expects you to work, and if you cannot, you will not last. Factories are the backbone of the city, and they are everywhere. Their chimneys rise into the fog like sentinels, belching smoke day and night. Inside, the conditions are worse than you imagine. Machines roar, gears snap, and belts spin at terrifying speeds. Men, women, and children work shoulder to shoulder, often for 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. There are no safety guards, no concern for well-being. A single slip of the hand can mean losing fingers or worse. If that happens, you are not compensated. You are replaced. Perhaps you are sent to a textile mill. The air is thick with lint, so dense that workers develop something called mill fever, a constant cough that can eventually collapse the lungs. Or maybe you end up in a match factory, where phosphorus clings to the worker's skin and teeth. Over time, their jaws begin to rot, a condition so horrific it becomes known as phossy jaw. The pain is unbearable, the disfigurement permanent. Yet workers continue, because to leave is to starve. And if you thought this fate was reserved for adults, you are mistaken. Child labor is everywhere. Children as young as 5 or 6 are sent into factories, mines, and chimneys. They're small. Hands are prized because they can fit into tight spaces where adults cannot. In textile mills, children crawl under machines to clean while the gears are still running. In coal mines, they drag heavy carts of coal through narrow tunnels on their hands and knees. Chimney sweeps small boys, sometimes no more than 4 or 5, are forced up soot-choked flues, their skin scraped raw, their lungs scarred forever. The sound of children coughing fills the air, but it is not just from smoke. Disease ravages them faster than adults, and accidents claim them daily. If you, as a visitor, are shocked by this sight, the locals are not. It is simply the way things are. Childhood is a luxury few can afford. Survival means labor. Even if you are not a factory hand or a child laborer, there is still work to be found, though none of it is easy. You might haul goods at the docks, your muscles straining as you lift barrels and crates for hours without rest. You might sell newspapers on a street corner, shouting headlines until your voice gives out. You might stitch shoes, polish boots, or carry water up and down endless flights of stairs. Every job is exhausting. Every job consumes you, and the pay. Miserable. Wages are so low they barely keep a person alive. A man might bring home just enough for bread and lodging, while women are often paid half for less of what men earn. For many women, prostitution becomes the only viable alternative. Entire neighborhoods, like the infamous East End, are filled with brothels. For some women, this is not a choice, but a necessity. a way to keep themselves and their children from starving. Society condemns them, but society offers no other path. Your stomach growls, reminding you that you need food. The trouble is, London's poor eat what they can afford, not what they want. A common breakfast is a heel of stale bread dipped in weak tea. Meat is rare and often questionable. Street vendors sell pies and sausages, but they are infamous for being stuffed with scraps no butcher would claim, gristle, bone, and in some cases, meat from animals that died of disease. Rats are not uncommon in the mix. If you are lucky enough to afford something fresher, you'll still find it tough and stringy. Hunger gnaws at you constantly, never fully satisfied, and hunger drives you to choices you thought you would never make. Stealing is common, not because people are dishonest by nature, but because desperation leaves no alternative. Bread, apples, call anything that can sustain you for another day might become the target of theft. But the risk is great. Victorian London is unforgiving to thieves. If caught, you might be publicly whipped, branded, or thrown into prison. And prisons are not cleaner or safer than the streets. Even if you try to live honestly, the cities. Weight crushes you. Rent for a room in a tenement eats away most of your wages. And those rooms are nightmares. Damp, windowless, crawling with vermin. 10, sometimes 20 people cram into a single space, sleeping shoulder to shoulder, the air rank with sweat and sickness. Privacy does not exist. Comfort does not exist. If you are ill, no one cares. You are expected to carry on until your body gives out. In such conditions, diseases spread with terrifying ease. Tuberculosis, smallpox, cholera, these are not distant threats. They are daily companions. You can hear the rasping coughs of your neighbors at night, punctuated by the occasional wail of a grieving parent who has lost a child. Medicine exists, but it is expensive and often ineffective. Doctors are few, and their treatments are sometimes worse than the illness itself. Leeching, purging, and toxic remedies are still common. If you fall ill, chances are you will not recover. And yet, the city continues to grow. More and more people pour in from the countryside, chasing the promise of work and opportunity. What they find instead is a relentless cycle of poverty, labor, and suffering. London does not slow down for anyone. It devours the weak and wears down the strong. By the end of just a few days, you would feel it in your bones, the exhaustion, the hunger, the hopelessness. Every breath feels heavier, every step harder. The city is alive, yes, but it thrives on your struggle. It feeds off your labor, your sweat, and your suffering. And if you cannot endure, there is always another desperate soul ready to take your place. If labor and hunger do not finish you, the streets of Victorian London will find another way. Disease is everywhere. It lurks in the water, floats through the air, hides in the food, and thrives in the very homes where people live. In this city, illness is not an exception, it is the rule. To survive here, your body must fight battles every day that you never prepared for. And for most people, it is a losing fight. Take a look at the water you drink. In Victorian London, the River Thames is both lifeline and graveyard. Every household, every factory, every slaughterhouse, and every sewer empties directly into its currents. Human waste, rotting animal carcasses, industrial chemicals, they all mingle in the same brown flow that carries your drinking water. Imagine cupping a bucket into the river, lifting it to your lips, and swallowing. You would taste filth, and worse, you would swallow death. Cholera spreads like wildfire this way, striking rich and poor alike. Entire neighborhoods collapse within weeks under its grip, victims struck by vomiting, diarrhea, and dehydration so severe that their bodies shrivel in hours. The government debates, doctors argue, but for years little is done. Some believe disease comes not from germs, but from miasma, bad air. And so they treat the problem by spraying perfume in the streets or burning incense to mask the smell. Of course, this does nothing to stop cholera, typhoid, or dysentery. The real killers move silently through the water and food, while Londoners breathe easier only because the stench is hidden. But cholera is only one enemy. Tuberculosis, called consumption, ravages London with relentless hunger. You hear its victims long before you see them deep, rattling coughs that echo through alleys and boarding houses. Faces grow pale, bodies thin and bloodstains. Handkerchiefs. It is so common that people almost accept it as inevitable. Entire families waste away, one after another, their lungs collapsing under invisible attack. For the poor, there is no cure, only suffering until death. Smallpox to storks. The city. Red pustules bloom on faces, arms, and bodies, leaving scars that never fade. For many, it is fatal. Survivors carry marks for life, disfigured reminders of the sickness that tried to kill them. Vaccines exist, but in the early years they are inconsistent and costly. Many cannot afford them. Others distrust them, fearing strange new practices. And so smallpox continues its grim harvest. Children are the most vulnerable. With weakened bodies and little resistance, they fall ill constantly. Measles, scarlet fever, whooping cough diseases we now prevent with simple shots claim young lives by the thousands. Parents weep, but grief is short-lived. For survival demands, they continue working. Mourning is a luxury few can afford. Walk down the streets and you will smell sickness. Tenements reek of damp and rot, their walls sweating with moisture, their floors sticky with filth. Families huddle in single rooms where disease spreads faster than fire. Bedbugs, lice, and fleas infest every corner, carrying more illness with them. Rats scurry freely, bold and unafraid, gnawing at scraps and corpses alike. The line between life and death is razor thin, and pestilence sharpens it daily. And when you fall ill, where do you turn? To doctors. For most of London's poor, that is a dream. Medical care costs money, and money is scarce. Hospitals exist, but they are overcrowded, unsanitary, and often more dangerous than the streets. Many avoid them altogether, fearing they will enter and never leave. The treatments you do find are often medieval in practice. Physicians bleed patients to balance the humors, draining life instead of saving it. They prescribe mercury for syphilis, a poison that rots the body as surely as the disease itself. They recommend arsenic for skin problems, opium for coughs, and alcohol for nearly everything. In truth, these remedies numb symptoms at best, kill at worst. Few ever truly heal. The rich may afford better care, but even they are not safe. Epidemics do not respect wealth. A gentleman in a fine suit may die as quickly as a beggar in rags if cholera reaches his cup. The difference is only in comfort. The rich die on clean sheets, the poor on cold floors. Then comes the stench of death. London's graveyards cannot keep up with the bodies piling in. Coffins stack one atop another. Shallow graves fill too quickly, and mass burials become common. The smell drifts into nearby homes, making the living choke as they try to sleep. Children play near burial grounds. Unaware, they dance on ground that holds hundreds of corpses just beneath the soil. And yet, life does not stop. The city presses on, fueled by denial and necessity. Markets reopen even as cholera spreads. Factories continue production even as workers collapse. Streets remain crowded, alive with coughing, crying, shouting, and laughter. For those who live, here disease is not unusual, it is simply part of existence. You live alongside it, as naturally as you breathe. Imagine yourself here, a visitor dropped into this storm. Your body is unprepared. Your immune system is foreign to these conditions. The food, the water, even the air you breathe carries risks you cannot see. Within days, perhaps hours, you might feel the fever creeping in, your stomach twisting, your lungs tightening. You would not last long. Surviving the labor was already impossible enough. Now, with sickness all around, your chances of surviving even 1 week shrank to almost nothing. If the back-breaking labor and constant threat of disease don't claim you, then Victorian London has another way to end your week, through its shadowy world of crime and punishment. Because here, danger isn't just in the water or in the air, it walks the cobblestone streets with you. The city is a magnet for the desperate. Every day, thousands flood in from the countryside, searching for work, food, or fortune. But London cannot feed them all. Many end up homeless, penniless, and willing to do anything to survive. And in such hunger, crime flourishes. Pickpockets haunt the markets, moving like shadows through the crowds. They slip coins from pockets, handkerchiefs from sleeves, even food straight from stalls. Children are trained to do it best, their small hands unnoticed, their innocent faces distracting. Entire gangs of orphans roam together, led by older criminals who use them like tools. You might feel a slight tug on your coat, think nothing of it, and discover too late that your purse is gone. Burglary is just as common. Windows left unlocked are invitations. Doors with weak locks are splintered open. Thieves slip into homes while families sleep, taking whatever can be carried: clothes, food, trinkets. In poorer neighborhoods, where families own almost nothing, they steal coal from storage bins or wood from fences, anything that can be burned or sold. Violence prowls after dark. Step into the wrong alley at night, and you might never return. Garrotters, as they are called, choke victims with ropes or scarves before robbing them. Drunken brawls erupt constantly outside taverns, leaving men bloodied or dead on the stones. Prostitutes are beaten by their clients, pimps, or the police themselves. And in the darkest corners of Whitechapel, whispers of murders echo crimes, so gruesome that newspapers struggle to describe them. The police are present, but they are not the force of protection we imagine today. At the beginning of the Victorian era, many Londoners distrusted the idea of organized policing altogether. They feared it meant tyranny, that the government would spy and control them. The early officers, nicknamed Bobbies after Sir Robert Peel, were mocked, attacked, even stoned in the streets. Their powers were limited, their resources scarce, and corruption often seeped into their ranks. If you were caught committing a crime, or even suspected, the justice system waiting for you is merciless. Courts are swift, punishments brutal. Theft of even small items can mean imprisonment, transportation, or worse. The prisons themselves are nightmares. Take Newgate Prison, looming like a fortress in the heart of the city. Inside, men, women, and children are crowded together. Cells are damp, dark, and filthy, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and disease. Food is scarce, blankets are fewer. Prisoners must often pay for their own straw to sleep on. Those who cannot afford it rot on bare stone floors. Violence is constant. Stronger inmates prey on the weaker. Guards turn blind eyes, and survival depends on alliances, bribery, or cruelty. And yet, even prison may be preferable to the hulking workhouses that double as places of punishment for the poor. Once you enter a workhouse, you are stripped not only of your belongings, but also your dignity. Families are separated, husbands from wives, parents from children. The food is watery gruel, the work endless, the rules strict. Speaking out of turn can mean confinement in dark cells or beatings. Many Londoners say they would rather starve on the streets than enter those walls. But Victorian punishment does not end behind bars. Public executions are still a grim reality, at least in the early years of the century. Crowds gather by the thousands outside prison gates, waiting to see men and women hanged. Vendors sell pies and gin, children sit on their father's shoulders, and neighbors cheer or jeer as the condemned take their final steps. It is entertainment, justice, and warning all at once. Even when public hangings are eventually banned, executions continue behind prison walls. Feeding London's fascination with death, transportation is another fate worse than death for many. Convicts, even for petty crimes, can be sentenced to years of labor in distant colonies like Australia. Shackled and loaded onto ships, they leave London behind forever. The voyage is brutal disease, hunger and despair follow them across the seas. Few ever return. Families left behind know they will never see their loved ones again. For women, punishment takes another cruel form. Those accused of prostitution, many of whom are simply poor women trying to feed themselves, face arrest, imprisonment, and forced medical examinations. The Contagious Diseases Acts allow authorities to subject them to invasive procedures under the guise of public health, while their male clients walk free. A woman's reputation can be destroyed with a single accusation, leaving her no escape. But further into the life she tried to climb out of, children are not spared. A hungry boy caught stealing bread can find himself in prison beside grown men. Others are sent to reformatories, where discipline is harsh and labor punishing. Some are transported overseas, their childhoods stolen before they even began. Childhood in Victorian London is not a shield but a vulnerability. Fear seeps into daily life. Imagine yourself walking these streets at night, lantern in hand, the fog rolling thick around you. You hear footsteps behind, quickening as yours do. A hand brushes your coat. A voice whispers from the shadows. Is it a thief, a beggar, a drunk, or someone far worse? You will not know until it is too late. And yet, despite the fear, crime never stops. Because for many, crime is survival. A loaf of bread, a stolen coat, a pocket picked. They mean the difference between living another day or starving tonight. Victorian London punishes them harshly, but still, more join their ranks each day. For you, as an outsider, this city would swallow you whole. If you avoided the disease and the work, if you somehow kept your belly full, you would still face the thieves, the gangs, the enforcers of the law, and the executioner's rope. Surviving 7 days here is not just unlikely, it is almost impossible. If you think survival in Victorian London was simply about dodging disease or avoiding the hangman's rope, you would be mistaken. The true test was in the relentless grind of daily life. Even behind closed doors, the home was not a sin, was another battlefield where hunger, labor, and expectations bore down upon every member of the family. For men, the pressure was crushing. A Victorian man was expected to be the breadwinner, the pillar upon which the household rested. But in a city drowning in unemployment and underpaid work, keeping food on the table was a struggle that drove many to despair. Skilled tradesmen, who once lived comfortably, found themselves undercut by industrial machinery and waves of cheaper labor. Carpenters, blacksmiths, and weavers faced declining wages, while dock workers and builders competed daily for jobs that might last only a week. A man without steady work was not just unemployed, he was disgraced in the eyes of society to feed their families. Many men turned to whatever labor they could find. Some became costermongers, selling fruit and vegetables from handcarts in the streets, shouting their wares in a desperate attempt to outcry the competition. Others hauled coal, carried bricks, or worked in factories, their bodies breaking under the strain. Alcohol became a constant companion gin, shops and public houses filled with men drowning their sorrows for a penny a glass. But drunkenness often led to violence at home, where wives and children bore the brunt of frustrations that could not be spoken aloud in public. For women, the role was no less punishing and often crueler. Society placed them firmly within the home, branding them the angels of the house. They were expected to keep households clean, raise children, and manage every detail of domestic life with grace. Yet behind this romantic ideal, the truth, was exhausting labor. Water had to be fetched daily, carried in heavy buckets from communal pumps or wells. Coal had to be shoveled, fires stoked, and ashes cleaned. Clothes were scrubbed by hand, boiled in great steaming pots, and beaten on washboards, until arms ached. Floors had to be swept, food prepared from scraps, and children tended from dawn until night. All of this was performed in dim, cramped rooms with little ventilation, often while pregnant or nursing another child. Middle-class families could afford servants, but even here, the women of the house carried enormous burdens. Respectability demanded immaculate homes, perfect meals, and constant supervision of staff. A single stain on a dress, a child misbehaving in public, or a guest noticing dust on the mantelpiece could ruin reputations. Women were judged not just by their looks, but by the efficiency of their households. The servants themselves lived lives of quiet torment. A maid-of-all-work, the lowest rung of domestic staff, was on duty from before sunrise until after midnight. She scrubbed floors, polished boots, emptied chamber pots, and prepared meals with almost no rest. Sleep was stolen in snatches, often on a hard cot in the kitchen. Her wages were meager, her employers strict, and her chances of marriage slim. Many maids were dismissed without references for the smallest infractions, leaving them unemployable. Some drifted into poverty or prostitution when service was no longer an option for children. Victorian family life was rarely tender. Infant mortality remained brutally high. 1 in 5 children did not live to see their 5th birthday. The loss of siblings was common, and parents hardened themselves to grief out of necessity. For those who survived, childhood was not a season of play but of labor. Poor children worked as soon as they could walk. Some sold matches, flowers, or newspapers on street corners. Others scavenged for rags, bones, and scraps in the filth of alleys. Chimney sweeps, some no older than 6, crawled through narrow, suffocating shafts. Their skin scraped raw, their lungs filled with soot. Factory children toiled for 12-hour shifts, fingers nimble enough to tie threads or crawl beneath machines too dangerous for adults. The law eventually set limits on child labor, but enforcement was weak, and poverty drove parents to send children back to work regardless. Even education, where it existed, was harsh. Schools were overcrowded, teachers brutal. Discipline meant canes, straps, or rulers across knuckles. Memorization was valued over understanding, and the poor often paid fees they could barely afford for even the most basic lessons. Still, for many children, schooling was a dream never realized, and beneath all of this lay the suffocating expectations of Victorian morality. Men and women alike lived under constant scrutiny, not just from neighbors, but from an entire society obsessed with appearances. A woman who failed to keep her house immaculate was judged lazy. A man unable to provide was mocked as weak. Children who misbehaved shamed the entire family. Respectability was currency, and losing it meant social ruin. Courtship and marriage were guided not by love, but by social standing. Women were pressured to marry well, for their value in society lay almost entirely in their husband's status. A young girl's future could be destroyed by gossip and indiscretion, or even being seen in the wrong company. Men of means might seek mistresses openly, while women accused of immorality could be cast out forever. The home, then, was not the sanctuary modern minds imagine. It was another battlefield, where survival was measured in reputation, labor, and unending sacrifice. A single week in a Victorian household, whether wealthy or poor, would drain you to the bone. The men exhausted and embittered. The women worn and invisible. The children robbed of their childhoods. And all of this was endured not in silence, but in a world where gossip traveled faster than the railways, where every neighbor's eye was another judge, and where even a whisper of failure could haunt a family for generations. For you, stepping into such a home would be suffocating. If you were born a man, you would collapse under the pressure of endless work and unrelenting judgment. If a woman, your life would not be your own, but bound by duty, labor, and the crushing weight of expectation. And if a child, you might not live long enough to complain. This was Victorian family life, not warmth and comfort, but duty and sacrifice. And no matter where you turned, it offered no escape. If you were to open your eyes one morning in Victorian London, the very first question you would face is simple. What would you eat? Food was not a matter of choice or preference. It was survival, and for many, barely that the Victorian diet, especially for the working poor, was monotonous, insufficient, and often dangerous. Bread formed the cornerstone of every meal, yet it was not the fresh, fluffy loaves you might imagine. Cheap bakers often adulterated flour with chalk, alum, or ground bones to stretch their supplies. This meant every bite risked poisoning your body slowly. Adulterated beer, watered-down milk, and sugar bulked with sand or grit filled the shops. Even sweets, a rare treat for children, could be laced with red lead to enhance color or copper sulfate to make them gleam more brightly. Breakfast, for most, was little more than bread crusts with weak tea, or perhaps porridge if oats could be. Afforded, middle-class families might enjoy bacon, eggs, or kippers, but this luxury was unthinkable in the East End's narrow streets. By midday, working men snatched a meal of bread and cheese or a meat pie bought from a stall, though the meat inside was often scraps of gristle, fat, or the parts of animals you would never willingly eat. Dinner, if it came, was stew or soup stretched with potatoes, turnips, or cabbage, occasionally flavored by a bone boiled for days. For the wealthy, of course, the picture was strikingly different. Dining tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, puddings, oysters, and elaborate desserts. But these meals were not mere feasts, they were performances. A Victorian dinner was a ritual of etiquette, with rules about who carved the meat, how one held a fork, and when one could speak. A single faux pas could mark you as uncouth, no matter how fine your clothing. The elaborate courses, however, were indulgences enjoyed by a fraction of society. For the majority, hunger gnawed constantly. Now consider clothing. For Victorians, dress was not simply protection from the elements. It was a declaration of identity, morality, and class. You could be judged, hired, dismissed, or even arrested based on your clothes. The poor wore garments patched and repatched until fabric dissolved into rags. Many children went barefoot even in winter, their feet raw against the cobblestones. A single coat might be shared among brothers, each wearing it in turn. Women's dresses were simple, often second-hand purchases from markets, stiff with dirt and smoke. Washing clothes was back-breaking work, and soap itself was a luxury, so garments often carried a sour, heavy odor of labor and unwashed bodies. By contrast, the middle and upper classes lived under the tyranny of fashion. Women endured corsets that singed their waists tightly, crushing ribs, restricting breathing, and even causing fainting spells. Layer upon layer of skirts, petticoats, and bustles made walking a chore. Men dressed in stiff collars, waistcoats, and long coats, every piece of cloth starched and tailored to perfection. Appearances were everything. A man with scuffed boots or a woman with an outdated bonnet could be mocked or excluded from respectable society. Clothing, then, was not just fabricate, was survival in a world where reputation could make or break a life. The rituals of daily living, too, were a minefield for anyone unfamiliar with the Victorian code of behavior. If you were invited to tea, for instance, you could not simply drink as you pleased. Tea was an elaborate performance. You must know how to stir your cup without clinking the spoon, when to lift your cup, and how to hold it without looking clumsy. To eat bread and butter, you must break off small pieces with your hand rather than bite into the slice. A single mistake in such rituals could cause whispers, snickers, and a swift decline in your social standing. And then there was hygiene, or rather, the lack of it. Imagine waking up in a cramped tenement room shared with 5 or 6 other people. The air heavy with smoke from coal fires, damp with mold, and stinking from the chamber pot in the corner. Public baths existed, but many could not afford the fee, so washing was a quick splash from a basin, if at all. Toothpaste was rare, soap expensive, and deodorant unknown. For women, menstrual hygiene was a constant struggle, often improvised with rags. The rich bathed more frequently, but even they lacked the modern comforts of plumbing. Water had to be heated manually, tubs filled bucket by bucket, and servants often carried the weight of this invisible labor. Now picture the streets and how they shaped daily ritual. You step outside, and the first thing you notice is filth. Horse manure covered the roads, rotting vegetable matter piled in alleys, and rats darted openly in broad daylight. Crossing a street meant risking not only a soaking from filthy puddles, but also the threat of being trampled by carriages. Women lifted their skirts high to avoid the muck, showing ankles that might draw unwanted attention. Boys scurried to sell. Services as crossing sweepers, clearing small paths through filth for a penny, meals, clothes, hygiene, movement all. These rituals were survival itself. The rich endured suffocating rules of etiquette that demanded endless effort to maintain. Appearances. The poor suffered the grind of hunger, filth, and improvisation, where a single loaf of bread or patch of cloth determined whether the next day brought dignity or humiliation. What makes this so shocking to modern eyes is how much time and energy daily survival required. Everything took longer, demanded more physical effort, and came with the constant possibility of failure. Imagine spending an entire day fetching water, boiling it, scrubbing clothes by hand, and collapsing into bed with nothing more than a slice of bread to show for it. Imagine being judged as unclean or immoral because your boots were worn down or your dress unfashionable. This was life in Victorian London, and it left no room for weakness. For you, stepping into this world would be overwhelming. Even before disease or crime could claim you, the act of simply feeding yourself, dressing properly, and navigating the rituals of daily life would break you down. The very rhythm of existence was punishing, and every detail of food, clothing, and manners was a test you would likely fail. This was not just survival. This was survival under the constant gaze of a society obsessed with appearances and built on the back of relentless labor. And it is here, in these smallest daily details, that you would find your willpower unravel long before a week had passed. If you were somehow managing to feed yourself and keep up with the endless rituals of clothing and etiquette in Victorian London, your next thought might be, what did people do for enjoyment? Surely, even in the smoke-filled, disease-ridden city, people sought distraction, laughter, and escape. They did. But in a society as rigid and stratified as this one, even leisure came with invisible chains. For the working poor, leisure was almost an illusion. 6 days a week, sometimes 7, were consumed by labor. Men toiled in factories, loading docks, or workshops for 12 to 16 hours a day. Women worked as laundresses, seamstresses, or domestic servants, with their own lives swallowed up by the demands of others. For children, play was nearly absent. Instead, they scavenged in the streets, hawked newspapers, or tended machines in textile mills. Leisure came only in snatched moments, stolen chat on a stoop, a few rounds of a street game, or a hymn sung in a church hall. And yet, the human spirit craves amusement. For some, that meant the music halls. These sprawling, noisy venues were the entertainment centers of the working class. Here, you could find singers belting out bawdy tunes, comedians cracking crude jokes, and dancers performing lively routines. The audience was loud, rowdy, and unapologetically spirited. It was escapism in its rawest form, a temporary rebellion against the misery of daily life. But even this carried risks. Drunkenness, brawls, and pickpocketing lurked in every corner. Respectable society scorned the music halls, considering them vulgar and morally corrupt. If you were middle class or higher, attending such places could ruin your reputation. For the middle and upper classes, leisure looked entirely different. It was structured, refined, and always tethered to morality. Afternoons meant tea parties, an institution in itself. These gatherings were not merely social, they were trials of etiquette. The arrangement of cups, the passing of trays, the selection of conversation topics, all adhered to unspoken rules. If you were invited, you had to know the dance of civility, where a misplaced spoon or an inappropriate remark could haunt your standing for months. Evenings might bring the theater. Victorian London's theatres varied widely. The cheap, rowdy houses staging melodramas for the masses, and the grand playhouses where Shakespearean revivals and new works by playwrights like Oscar Wilde attracted fashionable audiences to attend. The theatre was to be seen, and your attire and conduct mattered as much as your enjoyment of the play. But for the poor, the cost of admission even to the cheapest seats was often out of reach. Literature was another form of leisure, though, again divided by class. Serialized novels in cheap magazines reached even the working classes, with Charles Dickens, Wilkie Collins, and penny dreadfuls capturing the imagination. For a penny, young boys might read lurid tales of murderers, highwaymen, or monsters, their heads filled with grim excitement before returning to the grimness of reality. For the wealthier, reading was more than pastime, it was moral edification. Ladies' magazines instructed women in propriety, novels taught social values, and scientific works signaled education and refinement. To be seen as well-read was to be seen as respectable. Then there were the parks. By the mid-19th century, London had begun to open green spaces like Hyde Park and Regent's Park. These were intended as lungs for the choking city, places where the middle class could stroll, row on the lakes, or enjoy carefully manicured lawns. But even here, rules applied. One had to dress appropriately, behave calmly, and avoid anything that might seem vulgar. For the poor, the parks were accessible but intimidating. Spaces where they risked standing out for their ragged clothes and rough manners. Yet, not all entertainment was wholesome. Gin shops and taverns thrived across London, and for many of the poor, drinking was the only accessible form of escape. A few pennies could buy enough alcohol to dull the pangs of hunger and soften the edge of despair. But this too came with costs, violence, addiction, and moral condemnation. The gin palaces of the East End became symbols of both working-class desperation and middle-class fear. To the reformers and moral crusaders of the time, drink was the root of poverty, crime, and moral decay. And it was morality and iron grip on leisure that defined Victorian life. Pleasure was never just pleasure. It was weighed against religious duty, societal expectations, and the looming spectre of respectability. Families attended church not only for worship, but to be seen as upright and disciplined. Sunday, the so-called day of rest, was heavily policed by moral codes. For some, this meant sermons and hymns. For others, it was hours of boredom, forbidden from playing, working, or even laughing too loudly. Courtship and romance, too, were bound by rigid rules. A glance, a word, a walk together each carried meaning. For middle-class women, a single misstep in propriety could doom prospects of marriage, the only secure future available to them. Men faced expectations to appear honorable, industrious, and financially stable. Love was less about passion and more about negotiation, an alliance of families and reputations. To navigate this world without prior knowledge would be nearly impossible. Consider also the spectacles of public life executions, though dwindling by the mid-1800s, were still crowd events earlier in the century. Later, sensational trials filled the newspapers, turning criminals into celebrities of a sort. For many Londoners, these moments of collective attention were a strange form of entertainment, grim yet irresistible. And then there was charity, which for the wealthy often doubled as leisure, organizing bazaars, attending benefit concerts, or visiting the poor in workhouses were not simply acts of kindness, but also opportunities to display virtue. The moral economy of leisure meant that even enjoyment had to be cloaked in seriousness, usefulness, and discipline. For you, stepping into this society, the contradictions would be bewildering. Attend a music hall, and you risk being branded immoral. Refuse a tea invitation, and you risk offending a valuable acquaintance. Fail to read the right novels, and you might be dismissed as uneducated. Even in seeking rest or diversion, the Victorians lived under relentless scrutiny. Leisure was never free, was performance, obligation, and at times, punishment disguised as enjoyment. Now, pause and think about what you would do after a week of back-breaking labor or endless etiquette. Would you risk the rowdy music hall for laughter and song? Would you attempt to blend into the rigid rituals of a tea party, terrified of lifting your cup the wrong way? Would you drown your hunger in gin, knowing it might ruin you? In Victorian London, entertainment was not a relief, but another battlefield where reputation, morality, and survival collided. This, too, is why you would not last a week. Because even in your moments of rest, you would be tested, you would be judged, and you would almost certainly fail. If leisure in Victorian London was full of rules and moral tightropes, the streets outside were something else entirely, a place where those rules often broke down, and danger lurked in every shadow. To survive even a week here, you would have to navigate not only the choking air, the filth, and the poverty, but also the human threats that thrived in the cracks of the city. London was, in many ways, to cities. On one side stood the gleaming facades of the West End, with gaslit boulevards, theatres, and shops that dazzled with modern wonders. On the other side sprawled the East End and its labyrinth of alleys, tenements, and courts, where survival was a daily battle. Crossing from one world into the other was like stepping from daylight into shadowland. For the unprepared, the shadow could consume you. Let us start with crime. Victorian London was a breeding ground for thieves. Pickpockets, sometimes only children, darted through crowds with fingers nimble as spiders. They worked in groups, surrounding a victim with practiced choreography. One distracted, another jostled, while a third slipped a hand into your coat or bag. In a moment, your money, watch, or even your handkerchief was gone, and if you caught them, you risked being stabbed, beaten, or worse. Burglary was common too, especially in the poorer districts where locks were flimsy and desperation ran high. But even in wealthier neighborhoods, thieves scaled walls, slipped into kitchens, and disappeared with silverware or jewels. The police force, still in its infancy after being founded in 1829, struggled to keep up. Many Londoners mistrusted the police anyway, seeing them as more concerned with maintaining order than protecting the poor. Then there were the gangs. In the Rookery's infamous slum districts like St. Giles or Whitechapel, bands of criminals ruled with violence. They extorted protection money, ran gambling dens, and terrorized those who resisted. To wander into their territory after dark was to risk your life. Foreigners, strangers, and anyone who looked out of place were especially vulnerable at night. London's underworld flourished. Prostitution was rampant, with thousands of women, many only teenagers, forced into selling their bodies to survive. The city was filled with brothels, some disguised as boarding houses, others open secrets in otherwise respectable neighborhoods. The dangers were immense. Violence from clients, exploitation by pimps, disease like syphilis that had no cure, and the constant threat of arrest. Respectable society often blamed these women, seeing them as moral failures rather than victims of poverty. Drunkenness fueled much of this chaos. Gin and beer flowed freely in the countless taverns and alehouses, where men drank away their wages and tempers flared into fights. In the gin palaces, vast establishments decorated with mirrors and brass. The allure was irresistible: cheap alcohol, bright lights, and the illusion of escape. But once the drink took hold, the streets outside became a theater of violence. Domestic abuse, brawls, and robberies all spiked with intoxication. The city also bred infamous criminals who captured the public imagination. Murderers, thieves, and conmen filled the pages of penny dreadfuls and newspapers, turning crime into a grotesque form of entertainment. The case of Jack the Ripper, though later in the century, revealed the darkest corners of Victorian London, where police incompetence, public hysteria, and brutal violence converged. But long before that, countless unnamed victims fell prey to killers whose crimes went unrecorded. Even if you avoided the obvious threats, danger was never far. Gas lamps lit some streets, but many alleys remained pitch black. Fog thickened the night air, muffling sound and sight, giving criminals perfect cover. The phrase London particular was used for the dense, yellow smog that could make a man invisible a few feet away. In those moments, anything could happen: an ambush, a theft, a disappearance. Children, in particular, were both perpetrators and victims of crime. Orphaned or abandoned, they formed gangs of their own, surviving through theft, begging, or worse. They slept in doorways, scavenged scraps, and darted through the crowds of markets. Charles Dickens immortalized them in characters like the Artful Dodger, but in reality, their lives were brutal and short. Many died before adulthood, victims of hunger, violence, or disease. The police courts were filled daily with cases of theft, drunkenness, assault, and fraud. Punishments ranged from fines and short prison, sentences to transportation over Caesar, sentence that sent criminals to penal colonies in Australia. Prisons themselves were harsh and dehumanizing. Debtors' prisons trapped those who couldn't pay their bills, while hard labor prisons forced men to break rocks or tread endless wheels for hours. Imagine being caught stealing bread because you were starving, only to be condemned to months of crushing labor. And then there were the scams. Conmen prowled the city, selling fake medicines, worthless shares, or counterfeit goods. Street hawkers lured the desperate with promises of miracle cures or unbeatable bargains, only to vanish with their money. The gullible and the hopeful were easy prey. The moral panic of the time painted much of this as evidence of a society on the brink. Reformers railed against vice, calling for stricter policing, better education, and moral discipline. But the reality was simple. Poverty bred crime. When families lived in single rooms, when children went hungry, when work was scarce and wages low, survival often demanded breaking the law. For an outsider, dropped suddenly into Victorian London, the risks were immense. Without street smarts, without the right networks, you would be marked quickly as a target. Your clothing, your accent, your manner, anything could set you apart. Thieves would spot you. Conmen would corner you. And if you stumbled into the wrong alley at the wrong hour, you might never emerge again yet. What made the danger worse was the indifference of society. The wealthy could shut their doors, ride in carriages, and avoid the slums entirely. The poor lived cheek by jowl with crime, often with no recourse. The police, underpaid and overstretched, could not protect them. Newspapers sensationalized crime, but rarely offered solutions. And so the cycle continued, night after night, in a city that both feared and fed its underworld. Picture yourself at the end of a day in Victorian London. You step out of your cramped lodging, the fog curling around your boots. A whistle echoes in the distance, followed by a shout. Somewhere nearby, a fight breaks out, the sound of glass shattering. You turn down a narrow alley, only to realize, too late, that footsteps are following you. Would you run? Would you fight? Or would you simply vanish? Another nameless victim in a city teeming with stories of those who didn't survive. This is why you wouldn't last a week. Because the streets of Victorian London were not neutral ground, they were predators waiting for prey. And sooner or later, if you walked them unprepared, you would be swallowed whole. If the streets of Victorian London were dangerous after dark, the daylight hours brought their own torments. For most Londoners, survival hinged on work backbreaking, unrelenting, and poorly paid. To understand why you wouldn't last, even a week here, you need to imagine what it meant to live by your labor in a city where thousands competed for every job and failure meant hunger, eviction, or death. Work defined Victorian life. For the wealthy, it was about managing estates or investments. Occupations that took place in offices or clubs, often cushioned by servants and privilege. But for the vast majority, work meant long hours in factories, docks, workshops, or the endless service of others. The Industrial Revolution had turned London into a vast machine, and the people within it were the cogs replaceable, expendable, and easily discarded. Factories were the new cathedrals of industry. Inside, hundreds of men, women, and children toiled beside clattering machines. Cotton mills roared with spinning looms, ironworks blazed with heat, and match factories filled the air with phosphorus fumes. The work was relentless 10-12, even 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. Wages were meager, barely enough to cover food and rent. Safety regulations were few, and accidents were common. Fingers crushed, limbs severed, lungs scarred from dust and fumes, these were daily realities. If you fell ill or were injured, you were often dismissed without compensation. Another desperate worker would take your place by morning. Child labor was everywhere. Children as young as 5 worked as chimney sweeps, climbing through soot-clogged flues that could suffocate or burn them. Others carried loads in coal mines or ran errands through traffic-choked streets. Many worked as mudlarks, scavenging scraps from the filthy banks of the Thames, sifting through raw sewage and broken glass for anything of value. For parents with too many mouths to feed, sending children to work was not a choice but a necessity. Childhood, as we think of it today, hardly existed for the poor. Domestic service employed a massive portion of London's population, especially women. Servants worked in middle-class and wealthy households as cooks, maids, nurses, and footmen. For them, the workday never truly ended. A maid might rise at dawn to light fires, scrub floors, and prepare meals, only to fall into bed after midnight once her mistress's needs were met. Servants lived under strict rules, their lives controlled entirely by their employers. Mistreatment was common, wages were low, and privacy was non-existent. Yet many clung to these positions, as the alternative was far worse: the uncertainty of day labor or the brutality of factory work. The docks of London were another crucible of labor. Ships arrived constantly, carrying goods from across the empire. Dock workers loaded and unloaded cargo for meager pay, often hired on a daily basis. In what was called the call-on, men gathered in the morning, waiting for a foreman to choose who would work that day. The unlucky ones went home penniless, while the chosen toiled until exhaustion under brutal conditions. It was a lottery of survival, with hunger always the prize for losing. Not everyone could find steady work. Many survived through casual labor, odd jobs, or hawking goods in the street. Street sellers were a constant sight. Women with baskets of flowers, men pushing barrows of fish, children crying out the latest editions of newspapers. Each had their own calls and songs, creating a chorus of commerce that filled London's air. But profits were slim, competition fierce, and harassment from police or rival vendors a constant threat. For those with no work at all, the options were grim. Begging was one, though laws against vagrancy meant you risked arrest. The workhouse was another institution designed to house the destitute but notorious for their cruelty. Families were often separated upon entering, husbands from wives, children from parents. Life inside was harsh, with monotonous labor, thin gruel for food, and a strict regime meant to deter all but the most desperate. To enter a workhouse was to admit complete failure, a mark of shame in Victorian society. The psychological toll of poverty was immense. Hunger gnawed constantly. Malnutrition weakened bodies, leaving them vulnerable to disease. Cold winters brought frost into unheated homes, and many froze to death in their beds. Rent collectors showed no mercy. If you fell behind, you could be evicted without notice, your belongings tossed into the street. The fear of destitution was ever present, driving people to endure almost anything to keep a roof over their heads. Even those who worked hard could rarely escape the cycle. Wages were low, prices high, an unexpected misfortune, a lost job, an illness, a fire could plunge a family into ruin overnight. There were no safety nets, no welfare, no healthcare beyond what charity might offer. Survival meant constant vigilance, endless labor, and a resilience that few outsiders today can truly comprehend. Imagine yourself suddenly placed in this world. You wake before dawn in a single-room tenement shared with your family and perhaps another. You eat a crust of bread, perhaps dipped in weak tea if you can afford it. Then you walk to the factory where the machines roar so loudly you cannot hear your own thoughts. The air is thick with dust, the overseer's eyes always watching, his cane ready to strike. Hour after hour, you labor, your muscles aching, your mind numbed. At the end of the day, you were handed a few coins, barely enough to keep hunger at bay. Tomorrow, you will do it again, and the day after, and the day after, until your body breaks, or your job is taken. That is why you wouldn't last a week, because in Victorian London, work did not simply sustain life, it consumed it. And for the poor, life was measured not in hopes or dreams, but in hours sold to survive. If you thought hard labor was the great weight-crushing Victorian Londoners, you've only seen half of the story. Beyond the factory floor and the dockyard, another force kept the poor in chains. Money, or more precisely, the lack of it. Every aspect of life, from the roof above your head to the scraps on your plate, was controlled by an economy that seemed designed to punish the weak and reward only those already secure. Let's begin with housing. London's population exploded in the 19th century, and the city could not keep up. Millions poured in from the countryside and Ireland, all seeking work. Tenements sprouted like mushrooms, hastily built and overcrowded. Rents soared. Landlords realized they could divide old houses into single rooms and rent each to a separate family, earning far more than from a single tenant. A two-room flat might hold a dozen souls, parents, children, perhaps grandparents, even strangers forced together by desperation. Privacy vanished. Illness spread like wildfire through these packed warrens, and yet rents continued to rise. Rent day was a ritual of fear. Collectors came weekly, demanding coins from people who often didn't have enough to eat. Fall behind, even by a day, and you might find your possessions, what little you owned, thrown into the street. Neighbors would look on, sometimes pitying, sometimes indifferent, as the furniture, bedding, and clothing of another family lay scattered on the curb. Eviction was common, and for those already struggling, it meant one step closer to the dreaded workhouse. Was a shadow that followed every poor family. Credit shops sold food and goods to those who couldn't pay up front, charging inflated prices that kept customers perpetually in arrears. Pawn shops lined the streets, offering a few shillings in exchange for clothes, tools, or household items. Many families pawned their Sunday best on Monday to buy food for the week, then struggled to redeem them by Saturday so they could attend church respectably dressed. If they failed, shame followed, and sometimes the items were lost forever. It was a vicious cycle, repeated endlessly. Meanwhile, the wealthy and middle classes lived in an entirely different world. They occupied the grand terraces and elegant townhouses of neighborhoods like Mayfair, Kensington, and Bloomsbury. Their homes were filled with fine furniture, carpets, and servants. They enjoyed gaslighting, private gardens, and even flushing toilets long before the poor had such luxuries. To them, the struggles of the East End seemed distant, almost another planet. They spoke of the poor as if they were a species, apart, lazy, immoral, unworthy, acknowledging that their own comfort was built upon cheap labor and exploitation. Class was not merely an economic divide. It was a wall of culture and perception. The poor were caricatured in newspapers, depicted as dangerous, dirty, or feckless. Reformers sometimes tried to help, but even their efforts carried condescension. They believed the poor could be improved with discipline, temperance, and hard workers, if these people weren't already working themselves into the grave. The upper classes rarely recognized the structural forces: low wages, rising rents, lack of protections that kept millions in perpetual misery. Women bore a particular burden under this system. A widow without support could easily sink into destitution. Many turned to needlework, producing garments for pennies a day, often laboring from dawn to midnight just to earn enough for bread. Others became laundresses, scrubbing clothes until their hands bled. And when even these meager options failed, some turned to prostitution. One of the few professions that offered steady income, though it brought stigma, disease, and violence in its wake. Victorian London had tens of thousands of prostitutes, ranging from streetwalkers to high-class courtesans, all driven there by economic desperation. Children too felt the weight of this system. Beyond laboring in factories, many became street Arabs, homeless waifs who begged, stole, or sold trinkets to survive. The city's newspapers lamented their presence, yet society offered little in the way of solutions. Charities and reformers opened ragged schools and orphanages, but these reached only a fraction of the need. For most of these children, life was a brutal contest of survival, and many lost. One of the cruelest ironies of Victorian economics was that the poor often paid more for less. They bought food in tiny quantities, half a loaf of bread, a single candle, because they could not afford bulk purchases. This meant they paid higher prices than the wealthy, who could stock larders with sacks of flour and barrels of meat. Their housing, though cramped and filthy, often cost proportionally more than the spacious homes of the middle class. Poverty, in other words, was expensive. Yet amidst this bleakness, there were moments of resistance and solidarity. Poor families often supported one another, sharing food, lending money, or taking in boarders. Women formed networks of care, looking after each other's children or nursing the sick. In some neighborhoods, workers banded together to demand better pay or working conditions, laying the seeds for the labor movements that would later change Britain. Still, these efforts were small candles against a storm. Now, imagine yourself dropped into this world. You've worked all week, your body aching, and you've barely earned enough for rent and food. But your child falls ill. The doctor requires payment you don't have. You pawn your coat, then your boots, but it isn't enough. Rent day arrives, and the collector is at your door. You beg for more time, but he shakes his head. By evening, your few belongings are in the street, your family shivering in the cold, with nowhere to go but a shelter or the workhouse. This was the constant pressure cooker of Victorian London. Survival wasn't just about labor. It was about navigating a financial system designed to keep you on the edge of ruin. Every coin mattered, every debt threatened disaster. And the line between survival and destitution was thinner than a thread. And this is why you wouldn't last a week. Because here, even when you did everything right, worked hard, saved pennies, sacrificed endlessly, circumstance, illness, or chance could still sweep it all away. In Victorian London, poverty wasn't an accident. It was the condition of life for millions, enforced by an economy that offered no escape. When you pictured daily life in Victorian London, you might imagine hearty meals in bustling taverns, the smell of fresh bread wafting through cobbled streets, or families gathered around stews simmering on the hearth. But for most of the population, food and drink were anything but comforting. They were daily battles against hunger, against filth, and against the simple question of what was safe to put in your mouth. Let's start with bread. Bread was the staple of the poor, eaten with almost every meal. But Victorian bread wasn't always the wholesome, crusty loaf we might romanticize. Bakers often adulterated their bread to stretch profits, adding chalk, alum, or even powdered bones to the flour. These additives made bread look whiter, which wealthier customers considered more desirable, but they also wreaked havoc on the stomach. Many poor Londoners had no choice but to eat this tainted bread, knowing full well it could make them ill. Meat was a luxury rarely enjoyed by the working class. When they could afford it, it was often offcuts, scraps, or meat that was already beginning to spoil. There was no refrigeration, and slaughterhouses were notoriously unhygienic. Butchers sometimes brushed rotting meat with fresh animal blood to make it look newly slaughtered. Sausages were particularly infamous, crammed with mystery fillings. That might include sawdust, fat, or diseased organs. Charles Dickens once described sausages as mysteries of civilization. He wasn't exaggerating. Milk, too, carried hidden dangers. It was sold from pails on the street, often watered down to increase profits. Worse still, unscrupulous vendors sometimes added chalk or plaster to make the diluted milk appear creamy. Without pasteurization, milk carried diseases like tuberculosis, which could silently spread from cow to child. Families thought they were nourishing their little ones, but often they were handing them illness in a cup. And then there was water, or rather, what passed for water. London's growing population produced mountains of waste, and much of it ended up in the Thames. By mid-century, the river was a foul soup of human sewage, industrial runoff, and decaying matter. Water companies drew directly from it, sometimes upstream, sometimes downstream of sewage outfalls. and piped it into homes. Boiling could kill some germs, but many didn't bother or couldn't afford the fuel. The result was a constant risk of cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. Entire families could be struck down in days simply because they drank from the wrong pump. For many, the safer alternative was alcohol. Beer was often consumed daily, even by children, since the brewing process killed many germs. Gin, cheap and potent, became the escape of choice for the desperate. Gin palaces, lavishly decorated drinking halls, sprang up across the city, glowing with gaslights and mirrors. Inside, the poor drowned their misery in fiery spirits, if only for a few hours. To the wealthy, gin was a moral failing. To the working poor, it was relief from the crushing grind of existence. A typical working-class diet was meager: bread and dripping the fat left from cooked meat, perhaps a boiled potato, sometimes gruel-thin, porridge stretched with water. A lucky family might have a bit of salted herring or a stew with a bone for flavor. Tea became a crucial comfort, offering warmth and energy, though many could only afford to reuse the same leaves day after day. Children sometimes dined on street fare, cheap pies or baked potatoes bought for a penny. These were filling, but often unhygienic, cooked in questionable fat and sold by vendors who had little access to clean water themselves. Food poisoning was a frequent, if unspoken, reality. But hunger was worse. Malnutrition left children stunted, teeth rotted, and immune systems weakened. Adults worked grueling shifts without enough calories to sustain their labor. This made them vulnerable to disease, and once sickness struck, recovery was uncertain. A single bout of typhoid, cholera, or influenza could wipe out a household already teetering on the edge. Disease was an invisible enemy stalking every street. Cholera outbreaks in 1832, 1849, and later decades swept through London, killing tens of thousands. The connection between contaminated water and cholera wasn't fully accepted until Dr. John Snow's famous investigation in 1854, when he traced an outbreak to a single pump on Broad Street. Even then, authorities were slow to act and poor. Neighborhoods continued to drink from deadly sources. Tuberculosis, known as consumption, was even more insidious. Spread through the air, it crept into homes and lingered for years, coughing away the life of its victims. The disease didn't discriminate by class, but the poor, crammed into filthy, damp rooms, were its easiest prey. Wasting weakness, and the dreaded bloody cough became a familiar part of life. And then there were the fevers typhus, scarlet fever, diphtherial, thriving in the squalid conditions of the city. Children often died before reaching adulthood. In some neighborhoods, nearly half of all babies didn't survive to their 5th birthday. Death was a constant presence, not a rare tragedy. Doctors existed, of course, but medical care was another barrier for the poor. A visit from a physician cost more than most families could dream of spending. Hospitals were overcrowded, understaffed, and often more dangerous than staying home. Treatments ranged from ineffective to harmful: bloodletting, purging, and dosing. With mercury, many families turned instead to home remedies, herbal teas, poultices, or prayers. Sometimes they worked, more often they didn't. If you lived in Victorian London, your daily survival hinged on choices that seem impossible to modern eyes. Do you feed your child the only bread you can afford, even though you know it's been adulterated with chalk? Do you drink the water, risking cholera, or spend your precious pennies on gin instead? Do you pawn your last blanket to pay for a doctor, knowing the treatment may not work, or keep the blanket and hope the fever passes. The wealthy, again, lived a different reality. They dined on roast beef, oysters, and puddings served in courses by liveried servants. Their water was often filtered or drawn from cleaner sources. They had private doctors, nurses, and apothecaries ready to treat them at home. They read about cholera and typhoid in the papers, but many never saw its devastation firsthand. There, children had a far better chance of surviving to adulthood. This stark divide made Victorian London a city of contradictions. In Mayfair, you might see a banquet table glittering with silver dishes, while a mile east, a family huddled around a single potato. A rich gentleman could sip claret at his club, while a poor mother drank gin on an empty stomach to dull the hunger. The two worlds existed side by side, yet rarely touched. Imagine yourself thrust into this reality. By the end of your first week, you'd already be exhausted from labor, short on food, and uncertain whether your next meal would nourish you or poison you. Your water might carry disease. Your child's cough might signal something far worse than a cold, and the constant shadow of hunger would sap your strength. And that's the truth. You wouldn't last a week. Not because you lacked the will to survive, but because every ordinary necessity, food, drink, health, was a gamble. In Victorian London, the simple act of eating or drinking could be as dangerous as walking into a plague pit. Survival wasn't just about endurance. It was about luck, and for the poor, luck was in short supply. To understand why life in Victorian London was so perilous, we can't just look at work, food, and disease. We also need to step inside the cramped rooms where families lived, laughed, fought, and mourned. Because survival wasn't only about what you ate or how many hours you worked. It was also about the fragile bonds of family and community, and those too were constantly tested. Picture a typical working-class household in London's East End. A family of 6 might live in a single room with one narrow bed, a chair, and perhaps a rickety table. The bed was often shared by parents and several children. If there was a second bed or a straw mattress, it would be crammed against the wall, sagging with use. Privacy simply didn't exist. Every cough, every quarrel, every whispered secret was overheard. Children were expected to contribute from the moment they could walk and talk. Some were sent into the streets to sell matches, flowers, or watercress. Others carried baskets of coal or worked as mudlarks, scavenging in the filthy Thames for bits of metal or wood to sell. Many entered factories or workshops by the age of 8 or 9, where they toiled long hours in conditions that scarred their health for life. Childhood, as we know it today, was a privilege for the wealthy. For the poor, it was brief, hard, and often cut short. And yet, despite this, children still played. In narrow alleys, they chased one another, kicked ragged balls made of rags, or invented games with scraps of chalk and string. Their laughter rang out above the din of carts and shouting vendors. For many families, these fleeting moments of joy were a reminder of what they were fighting to preserve. A small spark of normalcy in a life of relentless struggle. Family relationships were complicated by constant pressure. Fathers, when employed, might spend 12 or 14 hours in brutal work, returning home exhausted and often irritable. Mothers carried the endless burden of holding the household together, cooking what little there was, mending clothes, minding children, and often working themselves as laundresses, seamstresses, or charwomen to scrape together a few extra coins. Domestic violence was not uncommon. fueled by poverty, stress, and cheap gin. Social reformers of the time wrote bitterly about wife-beating as a near epidemic. But there were also deep bonds of resilience. Many mothers in particular fought with every ounce of strength to keep their families intact, pawning their own dresses before letting their children go hungry, sitting by sick beds through long nights, or risking arrest by stealing bread when no other choice remained. Marriage, too, was a different institution than we might imagine. Among the poor, formal church weddings were often unaffordable. So many couples lived together without legal recognition. This left women vulnerable, especially if a partner abandoned them. For the wealthy, marriages were strategic alliances, cementing social position or financial stability. Love sometimes grew from these unions, but just as often it did not. Affairs, discreet or otherwise, threaded through all levels of society. For women, especially, Victorian London could feel like a trap. Middle-class ideals celebrated the angel in the house, a woman devoted entirely to her husband and children, submissive and pure. But for working-class women, survival demanded something harsher: resilience, endurance, and sacrifice. Many bore children almost every year, their bodies worn down by constant pregnancies and poor nutrition. Childbirth was dangerous, with maternal mortality shockingly high. To be a mother in Victorian London was to live always in the shadow of loss of children, loss of health, loss of stability, and the children themselves bore that shadow from the start. Infant mortality rates were staggering. In some districts, half of all babies died before their 5th birthday. Parents might christen multiple children with the same name, expecting that at least one would survive. Imagine the weight of that. Reality: to look at your newborn and know, statistically, they might not live past their 2nd birthday. When death did come, as it often did, it wasn't hidden away. Families laid out the body in the same room where they ate and slept. Neighbors visited to pay respects. Children grew up familiar with death, seeing it not as a rare tragedy but as a constant companion. Coffin makers worked around the clock, and cemeteries spilled over with graves. The mourning industry became a vast business, with black crepe, veils, and elaborate funerals for those who could afford them. For the poor, mourning was simpler but no less heartfelt: a ribbon of black cloth, a makeshift wooden cross, a whispered prayer. And yet, amid all this, people found ways to hold on to hope. They sang songs in public houses, shared jokes in the factory yard, and celebrated holidays with scraps of greenery or a rare treat of roast meat. The bonds of community often softened the blows of hardship. Neighbors might share a bit of coal, watch one another's children, or pull pennies to help a sick family. Charity, too, threaded through Victorian life. Churches, missions, and reform societies offered soup kitchens, shelters, or schooling for poor children. But charity often came with strings attached: sermons, moral lectures, and conditions about sobriety or attendance. Still, for many families, this assistance was the only barrier between survival and the workhouse. The workhouse was the spectre looming behind every poor household. It was meant to provide relief, but in practice, it was feared and despised. Families who entered the workhouse were split apart: men to one side, women to another, children to yet another. They lived under strict discipline, ate meager rations, and worked long hours. For many, the thought of being separated from their loved ones was worse than the hunger outside. Families clung desperately to one another, doing everything in their power to avoid that fate. In wealthier homes, life was different. but no less fraught with emotional complexity. Middle-class children were raised with strict discipline, expected to be obedient and pious. Fathers often remained distant, focusing on work or public life, while mothers oversaw the nursery and household staff. Childhood was prolonged for the wealthy, with toys, lessons, and tutors, but it was also shaped by rigid rules of conduct. A wealthy child might never starve, but they could grow up isolated, caught in a web of expectations. Emotions themselves were policed. Victorian culture valued restraint, propriety, and stoicism. Public displays of grief or anger were frowned upon, except in carefully scripted ways. Behind closed doors, however, emotions ran raw. Diaries and letters from the era reveal outpourings of despair, longing, or joy that never appeared in public. People lived double lives, one for society, one for themselves. So imagine yourself in this world. You, a modern viewer, accustomed to privacy, to space, to childhood as a protected time, would be dropped into a room where 6 people shared one bed. You would be expected to work from a young age, to watch your siblings die, to accept hunger as ordinary and loss as inevitable. Could you endure it? Could you hold on to your sense of self, your will to laugh, your capacity for love, in the face of such relentless hardship? That is the truth of Victorian family life. It wasn't only about physical survival. It was about emotional survival, about clinging to bonds of love and kinship, even when everything around you conspired to tear them apart. And for many, those bonds were the only thing that made life bearable, even if it didn't make it easier. When people today think of Victorian London, they often picture foggy cobblestone streets, horse-drawn carriages, and gas lamps glowing faintly in the mist. But those same streets were also crawling with thieves, pickpockets, and desperate souls who had turned to crime just to survive. In a city where hunger gnawed daily at the poor and opportunity was scarce, crime wasn't only a matter of greed, it was often the last bitter choice between starvation and survival. Theft was by far the most common crime. Bread stolen from a bakery, a handkerchief snatched from a pocket, a loaf of coal filched from a wagon. These were everyday offenses. Children, in particular, became infamous for their nimble fingers. Dickens didn't invent Oliver Twist's artful dodger-out of thin air. He was echoing what every Londoner knew, that gangs of children roamed the city, taught by older criminals how to slip a purse, distract a victim, or disappear into the alleys. But the punishment for these petty crimes was anything but petty. A boy of 12 might be sentenced to years in prison for stealing a loaf of bread. A woman who pilfered cloth from a market stall could find herself transported halfway across the world to Australia. Victorian justice was harsh and unforgiving, built less on rehabilitation than on deterrence. The idea that making an example of one criminal would frighten others into obedience. Prisons themselves were a nightmare. Cold, damp, and overcrowded. They were designed not only to confine, but to break the human spirit. The separate system, as it was called, forced inmates into solitary cells where they worked in silence, forbidden to speak to anyone. The theory was that solitude would lead to reflection and repentance. In practice, it led many to madness. Imagine being locked alone in a dark stone cell, allowed only a Bible and monotonous labor, picking oakum, twisting rope, or turning. A crank that served no purpose except to exhaust you. Other prisons enforced the silent system, where inmates worked side by side but were forbidden to speak or even glance at one another. Guards enforced discipline with harsh punishments. Bread and water, diets, beatings, or extended solitary confinement. The goal was obedience through fear. Prison reformers wrote about the despair etched into the faces of prisoners, the deadened eyes, the hollow silence of men stripped of all hope. But before prison came the courts. For the poor, standing before a magistrate was a terrifying ordeal. Trials were swift, often lasting mere minutes. Evidence could be flimsy, witnesses unreliable, and defense lawyers unaffordable. Judges were more concerned with maintaining order than with mercy. A single mistake could condemn you, and once the sentence was spoken, there was little chance of appeal. Public executions had largely faded by the mid-Victorian era, but the memory of them lingered. Until 1868, crowds of thousands gathered outside Newgate Prison to watch criminals hanged, jeering and cheering as the trapdoor fell. Even after executions moved behind prison walls, the knowledge that the state could take a life with ruthless efficiency hung like a shadow over the city. The gallows might not stand in the public square anymore, but its spectre still haunted every courtroom, and crime was not limited to the poor. Fraud, embezzlement, and corruption thrived among the wealthy and powerful. But the punishments for such crimes were far lighter. A wealthy man caught cheating in business might pay a fine and carry on. A poor man caught stealing bread might lose years of his life. Justice in Victorian London was not blind. It looked very carefully at class and wealth before passing judgment. Yet for many, crime was simply unavoidable. Take the example of costermongers, the street sellers who hawked fruit, fish, and odds and ends from handcarts. If they couldn't afford the day's license fee, or if a rival accused them falsely, they could be hauled before a magistrate and fined more than they could ever pay. Failure to pay meant prison. In such a world, one unlucky encounter with the police could drag an honest worker into the machinery of crime and punishment, from which escape was nearly impossible. Police themselves were a relatively new presence. The Metropolitan Police, founded in 1829, were still struggling to win the trust of Londoners. Many people saw them not as protectors, but as enforcers of a system rigged against the poor. They patrolled the streets in dark blue uniforms, their tall hats making them instantly recognizable. But they were not always effective at stopping crime. Thieves often outnumbered them, and whole districts, the infamous rookeries of London, were nearly impenetrable to the law. The rookeries were dense slums where narrow alleys twisted into darkness, where entire families crammed into single rooms, and where crime thrived in the shadows. Here, thieves, prostitutes, and the desperate rubbed shoulders. Police hesitated to enter, and when they did, they were often met with hostility from entire communities that saw them as outsiders. For someone living in a rookery, the line between survival and criminality was razor thin. The most vulnerable of all were women forced into prostitution. With few employment options and constant poverty, many turned to selling their bodies to feed themselves or their children. Victorian society condemned them harshly while ignoring the conditions that pushed them into such work. Police often harassed them, and reformers debated how to cleanse the city of their presence. But behind every statistic was a human story. A young woman driven by hunger, abandoned by family, or widowed without support. Crime in Victorian London was never just about law-breaking. It was about a city so unbalanced, so divided between wealth and poverty, that desperation was inevitable. And once caught, the poor were trapped in a cycle from which few ever escaped. A single week in this world could mean one bad choice, one hungry night, one unlucky run-in with a policeman, and suddenly your freedom, your family, even your sanity could be stripped away. Now imagine yourself there. Perhaps you're a servant, accused of stealing silver even if you didn't, or a child caught with fruit you picked up off a cart. You stand trembling in front of a stern magistrate who sees dozens like you every day. He doesn't see your hunger, your fear, your family waiting for you at home. He only sees another petty thief to be punished. Could you endure the sentence? Could you walk through the gates of a Victorian prison and keep your mind intact? That is the machinery of justice in Victorian London. Not justice as we might hope to know it, but justice as the Victorians wielded it. Sharp, merciless, and unforgiving. And for the poor, it was one more reason why you wouldn't survive a week. In this city, if the law and its prisons represented one face of Victorian London, then the underworld represented the other. For every courthouse and police patrol, there were back alleys and taverns where the law never seemed to reach. And if you were poor, hungry, or simply unlucky, this underworld might pull you in whether you wanted it or not. To understand the dangers, you must picture the rookeries, the slums, so notorious that the very word became a synonym for crime. The most infamous was St. Giles, a labyrinth of crumbling tenements and twisting alleys. There, buildings leaned so close together that sunlight barely touched the ground, and the air was thick with the stench of refuse and unwashed bodies. Entire families lived in single rooms, while landlords subdivided houses into tiny cubicles, crammed with LODGRS. But beyond poverty, the rookeries fostered something else. Networks of survival. Thieves, beggars, prostitutes, and hustlers shared information, looked out for one another, and resisted police intrusions. Outsiders saw only filth and vice. But for those who lived there, it was also a place of community, even if that community thrived on the edge of the law. Step into a rookery tavern, and you would find a world far removed from the polite drawing. Rooms of Bloomsbury or Mayfair. Smoke choked the air, cheap gin sloshed in cracked glasses, and voices rose in laughter, argument, and song. Here, criminals struck deals, fencers bought stolen goods, and gangs recruited new members. Many who entered such places did so not because they sought crime, but because hunger or eviction left them no other refuge. The gangs themselves varied widely. Some specialized in pickpocketing, sending children into the streets to practice the trade. Others focused on burglary, using information passed by servants in wealthy households. There were also gangs of bludgeon men, hired muscle who would beat, intimidate, or guard as needed. And above them all were the fencers, the brokers who turned stolen goods into profit, laundering crime into commerce. Yet the underworld was not merely criminal. It was a shadow economy that filled the gaps left by legitimate society. Need lodging for a night, but can't pay. A rookery matron might rent you a corner of her floor for a penny. Need food? A stew seller would ladle thin broth into your tin. Mug for a halfpenny. Need clothing? The rag market sold second-hand garments, often stripped from corpses or stolen from wash lines. Everything had a price, and nothing was guaranteed clean or safe. Prostitution was woven into this economy. Brothels ranged from dingy, vermin-infested houses in the slums to more discreet establishments catering to wealthier clients. Women often had no choice but to enter this trade, and once inside, leaving it was nearly impossible. Diseases like syphilis spread unchecked, while moral reformers lobbied for Contagious Diseases Acts that targeted women for medical examinations, but left male clients untouched. It was a world where respectability was demanded of the powerless but ignored by the powerful. And then there were the opium dens. Popular imagination often exaggerates them, but they were real hidden rooms where the drug was smoked in long pipes, often mixed with tobacco. Sailors brought opium into London, and it soon found a market among both the desperate poor and the thrill-seeking elite. In the haze of smoke, men and women lay sprawled, drifting between wakefulness and dreams, their troubles dulled for a few brief hours. But addiction was a cruel master, leaving its victims gaunt, sick, and trapped in a downward spiral. Nighttime in Victorian London was especially dangerous. Gas lamps illuminated the main thoroughfares, but alleys and side streets were swallowed in shadow. The city's fogs, thick, yellowish, and choking, made even familiar streets treacherous. Criminals took advantage, slipping in and out of the mist to strike at unsuspecting passers-by. For women walking home alone, the risks were especially high. For men, too, a chance encounter with a gang could mean a brutal beating and a stolen wallet. One notorious practice was garroting, a form of mugging where attackers strangled victims with a rope or arm around the neck while accomplices rifled through pockets. These attacks caused such panic in the 1860s that Parliament passed harsher laws and increased street patrols. But the fear lingered, and for good reason. In a city of millions, darkness was the criminal's ally. Even the wealthy were not safe. They might avoid the slums, but the underworld had ways of reaching into drawing rooms and country houses. Servants, underpaid and overworked, sometimes sold information to burglars. Street gangs targeted fashionable neighborhoods, slipping past watchmen, and scandals, affairs, debts, secret visits to brothels became fodder for blackmail. Respectability could be as fragile as a sheet of glass, and once shattered, there was no mending it. Yet the underworld had its strange glamour. Penny Dreadful's cheap serialized stories sold for a penny dramatized the lives of highwaymen, thieves, and murderers. Characters like Sweeney Todd, the demon barber of Fleet Street, thrilled readers with tales of grisly crime. Children devoured these stories, imagining themselves as bold adventurers rather than as future prisoners. The irony was bitter. While society condemned criminals, it also sold their images as entertainment. But beneath the lurid tales lay a harsher truth. Crime was not romantic for those who lived it. It was desperate, dangerous, and short-lived. Many thieves ended in prison, transportation, or an early grave. Women in prostitution often died young, their bodies weakened by disease and hardship. And families trapped in the rookeries rarely found a way out. For you, dropped into this world, survival would be precarious. Could you navigate the dark alleys without stumbling into danger? Could you tell which taverns were safe and which were ruled by gangs? Could you feed yourself without falling into crime? Or would hunger push you to theft, risking prison? The city would press upon you from every side, its poverty and temptation gnawing at your resolve. Victorian London's underworld was not simply a backdrop, it was the city's heartbeat, pulsing in the shadows of wealth and empire. And if you spent even one night in those rookeries, one night breathing the fetid air and hearing the cries from the alleyways, you might understand why so many never escaped. This was not a life of choice. It was a life of necessity, and, for you, a visitor from another age, it would be almost impossible to endure. If poverty and crime did not undo you in Victorian London, then disease almost certainly would. The city was a breeding ground for illness, its crowded housing and filthy streets providing perfect conditions for epidemics to spread. For all the marvels of the industrial age, Medicine lagged far behind. Doctors groped in the dark, fighting illnesses they did not understand with remedies that often did more harm than good. Imagine yourself waking up one morning in a damp room in the East End. The air smells faintly of sewage drifting from the open drains outside. You hear coughing deep, wet, hacking coughs echoing through the thin walls. Tuberculosis, or consumption, was so common it was practically expected. Families knew it by sound alone. If one member fell ill, others in the household would likely follow. But tuberculosis was only one enemy. Cholera haunted the city in waves of epidemic. In 1832, 1849, 1854, and 1866, the disease swept through London, killing thousands within days. Victims suffered agonizing cramps, vomiting, and unstoppable diarrhea until they collapsed, dehydrated, and blue-lipped. No one knew the cause. Many believed in miasma, the theory that foul smells carried disease. They could not see the real culprit, the contaminated water supply. One doctor, John Snow, famously traced a cholera outbreak in 1854 to a single contaminated water pump on Broad Street. His map of cases and insistence on removing the pump handle became a landmark in medical history. But in the moment, most authorities dismissed him. People kept drinking the same water, and cholera kept returning. Smallpox, too, ravaged London. Its victims broke out in painful pustules that scarred survivors for life. Vaccination existed, thanks to Edward Jenner's work in the late 18th century, but public suspicion was fierce. Some feared the vaccine would turn them into cows. Others could not afford to reach a doctor, and even when available, early vaccinations were risky, often leaving terrible infections at the injection site. Typhus and typhoid fever stalked the poor. Both thrived in filth and close quarters, spreading through lice and contaminated food. Fever hospitals overflowed with sufferers. For the rich, the diseases were frightening but avoidable with enough distance from the slums. For the poor, they were part of life's grim lottery. Infant mortality was staggering. In some districts, nearly 1 in 3 children died before the age of 5. Whooping cough, measles, and diphtheria swept through families unchecked. Mothers buried child after child, sometimes so weary from grief that the act of mourning became routine. The city's cemeteries swelled, and overcrowded graveyards led to the rise of massive new burial grounds, like Highgate Cemetery, where, even in death, class dictated the size and decoration of your resting place. And yet, the medical profession offered little comfort. Hospitals were grim places, often avoided unless absolutely necessary. Surgery was performed without anesthesia until the mid-19th century, meaning patients endured amputations and extractions fully conscious, restrained by attendants. When chloroform and ether were introduced, some doctors resisted, calling it unnatural. Others misused the substances, overdosing patients. Even if you survived the pain, infection was likely. Surgeons operated with bare hands, in blood-stained coats they considered badges of honor. Instruments were rarely sterilized. Germ theory had not yet gained traction, so the idea of invisible organisms causing infection seemed fanciful. As a result, hospital wards were nicknamed gateways to death. Many entered hoping for healing, but left in a coffin. Quacks and patent medicines thrived in this environment. Newspapers brimmed with advertisements for miracle cures, tonics, pills, and powders promising to heal everything from indigestion to syphilis. Most were mixtures of alcohol, opium, or mercury. Some offered temporary relief. Many caused lasting damage, laudanum, an opium tincture, was sold over the counter and used by everyone from mothers soothing fussy infants to writers seeking inspiration. Addiction spread quietly, masked as self-medication. Mental illness received even harsher treatment. The asylums of Victorian England were bleak, overcrowded places. Patients were subjected to restraints, isolation, and experimental treatments ranging from cold water baths to electric shocks. Women, in particular, were vulnerable to being institutionalized for reasons as vague as hysteria or disobedience to a husband. Once committed, release was uncertain. Midwives and folk healers still played crucial roles, especially among the poor. Herbal remedies, charms, and whispered incantations blended into daily life. While many mocked these practices as superstition, some proved surprisingly effective, a reminder that lived experience often carried wisdom that science had yet to uncover. Death was a constant companion. It shaped the culture of mourning, giving rise to elaborate rituals. Families draped their homes in black, wore mourning clothes for months or even years, and covered mirrors to prevent the soul from being trapped. Entire industries thrived on grief: mourning dressmakers, undertakers, and sellers of black crepe. For the wealthy, mourning was a display of respectability. For the poor, it was another expense to bear. But even in death, corruption lurked. The resurrection men, body snatchers, dug up fresh graves to sell corpses to medical schools for dissection. Though laws eventually regulated the trade, the fear lingered. Families placed heavy slabs or iron cages over graves to prevent loved ones from being stolen. If you found yourself in this world, the odds were stacked against you. A scratch on your hand could fester into a fatal infection. Drinking water might carry cholera. A crowded tenement could expose you to tuberculosis or typhus within days. And should you seek help, the hospital might kill you faster than the disease itself. The Victorians were not ignorant. They were fighting with the tools they had. But progress was slow, uneven, and often resisted. Only toward the very end of the century, with advances in sanitation, vaccines, and antiseptics, did survival become more certain. Until then, London was a city under siege, not just from crime or poverty, but from the invisible armies of disease that marched through its streets, taking victims without mercy. And if you thought you could escape it by clinging to wealth or status, remember, disease respected no boundaries. Princes and paupers alike succumbed. Even Queen Victoria herself lost a child, Princess Alice, to diphtheria. Death was the great leveler, and in Victorian London, it waited around every corner. By now, you've seen pieces of Victorian London from many angles. The suffocating poverty, the brutal labor, the endless crime, and the invisible killers of disease. But what happens when you stitch these together into the reality of daily life? Let's step back and walk through what a single week might look like for an ordinary Londoner. It is Monday morning. The fog has not lifted, though calling it fog feels polite. It is a choking blanket of soot, coal, smoke, and factory fumes. Your chest aches with each breath, but there is no time to rest. Work begins early, and lateness is punished harshly. You pull on the same threadbare clothes you wore yesterday, hoping they will survive another day. Hunger gnaws at you, but there is no breakfast waiting, only the faint memory of stale bread shared the night before. You step outside. The street is alive, though not in any way you would want. Mud, refuse, and horse manure mix into a foul paste under your boots. Children dart between carriages, barefoot and hollow-eyed. their voices shrill as they beg. Please, sir, a farthing, just a farthing. Their pleas are so common that they melt into the noise, ignored by most passers-by. The workhouse looms as a constant threat. Fail to keep your job, and it becomes your destination. A place of regimented misery where families are split apart. Meals are meager, and labor is endless. Many prefer crime to such degradation, which is why pickpockets, swindlers, and thieves haunt every corner. You check your pockets instinctively, knowing that anything valuable could vanish in seconds. By midday, you are at work. If you are lucky, it is a factory or a workshop, hot and deafening, with air thick from dust and fumes. If unlucky, it is the dockside or the mines, back-breaking and perilous. Injuries are frequent, compensation non-existent. Lose a hand, an eye, or your strength, and you will be cast aside, replaced without hesitation. Evening comes, but there is no relief. For the working poor, rest means returning to a tenement crammed with other families. Space is so tight that a single room might house 6 or 7 souls. The air is damp, the walls crawling with vermin. You hear coughing again, a reminder that sickness never sleeps. A neighbor's child lies pale and motionless in the corner, another life claimed before it could truly begin. No one pauses. Death is too familiar. Tuesday brings rain, though it changes little. The streets flood with filth, the Thames rising with the weight of sewage and industrial waste. The river is both lifeline and poison, carrying barges of goods one way and waves of disease the other. People gather water from pumps, never knowing which ones will carry cholera this week. You drink because thirst leaves no choice, hoping silently that fate spares you. By Wednesday, hunger has sharpened its claws. Wages are barely enough for bread, let alone meat. Many survive on tea and potatoes, stretching every coin you pass. A gin palace, its golden glow spilling onto the dark street. Inside, the working poor drown their despair in cheap gin, the so-called mother's ruin. Drunken figures spill onto the pavement, singing, shouting, sometimes fighting. For many, alcohol is not just an escape, it is the only comfort in a life of relentless struggle. Thursday dawns with sirens. A fire has broken out in a nearby alley. The cramped wooden houses are tinderboxes, flames racing through them in minutes. Families flee with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The fire brigade arrives, but for many it is too late. Loss is another common language in this city of homes, of possessions, of loved ones. On Friday, rumors spread of an outbreak. Cholera, again. The word alone sends shivers, though few truly understand what it means. Some flee the neighborhood, others cling to faith or superstition, hanging charms or burning herbs to ward off the unseen. The sick are carried to fever hospitals where survival is slim and conditions horrific. If you are unlucky enough to fall ill, your family begins mourning before you are gone. Saturday offers no reprieve. If you are a woman, you may spend your day laundering clothes in freezing water, your hands raw and bleeding. If you are a child, you may still be at work, sweeping chimneys or scavenging scraps of coal. Childhood, as you understand it, hardly exists. For many, play is replaced by labor from the moment they can walk. By Sunday, the churches swell. Religion provides structure, guidance, and sometimes comfort. Sermons thunder about morality, sin, and the promise of salvation. But outside the church doors, poverty waits still. Families who have prayed for deliverance return to cold homes and empty plates. Faith helps them endure, but it does not fill their bellies. This is a week in Victorian London. No villains needed, no great disasters required. Survival itself is the battle, and the city is a merciless opponent. It is easy to imagine that you might endure it with strength or wit, but think carefully. Could you really? Could you walk those alleys with your stomach empty, your lungs burning, and your pockets vulnerable? Could you carry water that might kill you, sleep beside corpses in a slum, and rise each morning to labor that breaks your body without feeding it? Could you bury a child and still rise for work the next day? Because if you did not, the rest of your family would starve. The truth is, most of us today would not last long. We live in a world of clean water, antibiotics, labor protections, and safety nets that Victorians could hardly dream of. Their endurance was born of necessity, their resilience carved out by hardship. And while we may marvel at their achievements, the railways, the literature, the art, we should also remember the millions of forgotten souls who carried the true weight of that era, whose lives were brutal, short, and often invisible. Victorian London was a city of contradictions, glittering wealth beside crushing poverty, innovation alongside ignorance, progress tangled with suffering. It is tempting to romanticize its cobbled streets and gaslight glow. But look too closely, and the shine fades, replaced by the stench of sewage, the cough of the dying, and the shadow of hunger. So when you picture yourself there, surviving even a week, remember, it was not the great events or scandals that broke most people. It was the ordinary, everyday grind of misery. That is the dark side of Victorian life, not hidden, but so common it was taken for granted. And that is why, if you found yourself in those streets, you would not survive.